1882. The five Chinese families that built the railroads and transformed the American West. The Anonymous Builders, 15,000 Chinese and a railroad that changed America. China in 1850 was a country in catastrophe. The Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war in the southern provinces that lasted from 1850 to 1864, killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people, making it the deadliest armed conflict in human history to that point. Entire regions were depopulated. Agricultural production collapsed. Famine followed war. The provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi in the Pearl River Delta of southern China were the epicenter of the crisis. And they were the same provinces from which the first waves of Chinese immigrants to California had come in 1849, drawn by news of gold at Sutter's Mill. By 1865, the California gold rush was over, and the Central Pacific Railroad, tasked with building the western half of the first transcontinental railroad, was running out of workers. White laborers were unreliable, drifting off to mining claims or other opportunities whenever they heard a rumor. The railroad's superintendent of construction, Charles Crocker, proposed a controversial solution: hire Chinese workers who had settled in California by the thousands and were being systematically excluded from most other forms of employment by laws and customs designed to prevent them from competing with white workers. The experiment began with 50 men. Within 2 years, between 10,000 and 15,000 Chinese workers, 90% of the entire Central Pacific workforce, were driving the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad across the Sierra Nevada and into Utah. They worked in conditions that white workers refused to accept, hanging in wicker baskets over vertical granite cliffs to drill and blast ledges for the roadbed, digging tunnels through the solid rock of the Sierra Nevada by hand in winters when more than 40 feet of snow fell and avalanches buried entire work gangs in their camps, heating black powder and the newly invented nitroglycerin into confined rock faces and running before the explosion. They were paid $26 a month, about half what white workers earned for the same labor, and they had to pay their own food and lodging out of that wage. Their white counterparts had those costs covered by the company. On June 24, 1867, 3,000 Chinese workers spanning 30 miles of track laid down their tools in the most organized and disciplined labor action the country had seen since the Civil War. They walked to their camps and sat down. They demanded equal pay, a 10-hour workday in the open air and an 8-hour day in the tunnels, and the elimination of the most dangerous powder work without additional compensation. Crocker responded by cutting off their food supply and threatening to import replacement workers from China. The strike collapsed after a week. The Chinese went back to work. The Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869. Not one Chinese worker appeared in the famous photograph of the ceremony. The men who built the railroad were not invited to the celebration. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about this video. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The Massacre Years: How America Repaid Its Chinese Workers. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. What followed for the Chinese workers who had built it was not gratitude or recognition, but a sustained campaign of violence, legal exclusion, and economic destruction that lasted for more than 60 years. In the cities and mining towns of the American West, the completion of the railroad had created a surplus of Chinese laborers who now competed with white workers for jobs in mines, factories, and farms. The response of white working-class communities was systematic and often lethal. In Los Angeles in October of 1871, a white mob of approximately 500 people moved through the city's Chinatown district. shooting into homes and dragging residents out into the street. 19 Chinese men and boys were lynched before federal troops arrived. No white person was convicted of any crime. In Truckee, California, the town's Chinatown was set on fire immediately after the railroad's completion by white residents who had organized a campaign to drive out the Chinese community. In Reno, Nevada, the Chinese district was burned to the ground twice in 30 years. On September 2nd, 1885, in Rock Springs in the Wyoming Territory, a mob of more than 100 white miners armed with guns, hatchets, and clubs moved through the Chinese quarter of the town in the middle of the afternoon. 28 Chinese miners were killed. 15 were wounded. 79 homes were looted and burned. The victims were former Central Pacific Railroad workers who had moved to Rock Springs to work the Union Pacific coal mines after the transcontinental line was finished. 16 white miners were arrested. All were released on bail. No one would testify against them. No charges were ever filed. Congress eventually approved $150,000 to compensate the survivors for their destroyed property. And 2 years before Rock Springs, on May 6, 1882, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in American history, to restrict immigration based on race and national origin. The Chinese population of the United States fell from over 100,000 in 1890 to 61,639 by 1920. The exclusion laws remained in force for 61 years. The Louis family, the builder who made San Luis Obispo. An Wang was born on March the 25th, 1840, in a village in Taishan County in Guangdong Province, southern China. He arrived in California between 1856 and 1861, drawn by the gold rush, but finding nothing in the mines. He worked as a laborer in Oregon, moved south along the California coast, and by 1870 had settled in San Luis Obispo, a small coastal town with a population of fewer than 100 people, where he found work as a hotel cook. He changed his name to Louis, the name of a co-worker which a colleague had suggested would sound more American, and began the work of building one of the most consequential Chinese-American enterprises in California history. He organized his first work crew of Chinese laborers in 1873 to help construct the Pacific Coast Railroad, arranging for 160 Chinese workers to be brought from San Francisco by schooner. By 1877, he was bidding on county road contracts and winning them. He built the stage road over the Cuesta Grade, portions of which are still navigable today. He drained the swamp around Laguna Lake. In 1882, he reclaimed acres of farmland for cultivation. In 1884, he won the contract from the Southern Pacific Railroad to construct the 4 tunnels through the Cuesta Grade that would finally connect the rail lines of Northern and Southern California into a single statewide system. The contract required 2,000 laborers and took 10 years to complete. 5 of those tunnels are still in active use today. He opened the Louis store on the corner of Palm and Coro Streets in San Luis Obispo in 1874, a combined counting house, pharmacy, post office, employment office, bank, and general store that became the nucleus of the city's Chinatown and the commercial center of the Chinese community across the entire Central Coast. He built the first brickworks in Central California, and the bricks his workers made went into many of the historic buildings of San Luis Obispo that still stand today. He started the vegetable and flower seed industry on the Central Coast. He lent money to community members and carried all the figures in his head, never using a ledger book. He was called the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. He lived to 96 years old, dying in San Luis Obispo on December the 16th, 1936. The store building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Quinn family, the mayor who wrote it all down. Tom Chong Quan was born in the Kaiping district of Guangdong province in southern China on December 5th, 1848. His family moved to Canton when he was young, giving him access to education that included English language instruction at an American missionary school, a rare advantage that would prove decisive. His family sent him to California in 1868. He arrived in San Francisco at age 19 and lived in Chinatown for 6 years, working as a houseboy and cook and continuing his studies at a Christian mission while his uncle helped cover expenses. He cut off his queue, the traditional long-braided ponytail that Chinese men were required by imperial law to maintain, while working in a coal mining camp in Alaska in 1877. It was a declaration. He was not going back to China. He had already begun writing his diary. In 1880, he arrived in San Diego, where two prominent local businessmen, George Marston and a minister named Reverend Camp, had identified him as the ideal candidate to serve as labor contractor for the California Southern Railroad then under construction. His bilingualism, his education, and his standing in the Chinese community made him uniquely suited to recruit workers, negotiate with foremen, manage supply chains to work gangs, and navigate the complex social terrain of a Chinese immigrant community operating under constant legal and physical threat. He worked for the railroad for 5 years, kept a daily diary of his work and personal life, and in 1881 returned to San Francisco to marry Su Leong, a woman he had met at the Chinese Presbyterian mission. They returned to San Diego and had 12 children. Their first son, George, born in 1885, was the first Chinese boy ever born in San Diego. After leaving the railroad, Quinn expanded into retail merchandising and real estate, acquiring properties across the county and leasing agricultural land in Mission Valley and along the Sweetwater River. He became the unofficial mayor of San Diego's Chinatown, a formal title that no law permitted a Chinese person to hold and that the community conferred on him anyway. His 11-volume diary, written primarily in English between 1877 and 1902, is the oldest known English-language manuscript produced by a Chinese immigrant to the United States. He died in 1914 after being struck by a motorcycle near his home in San Diego. His descendants have maintained the oral history of his life across the generations. The Exclusion Law, 61 years of closed doors. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. It was the first law in American history to restrict immigration on the basis of race and national origin. It suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. It declared Chinese immigrants, including those already living in the United States, ineligible for naturalization. It required every Chinese person traveling in or out of the country to carry a certificate. And it established, for the first time in the country's history, the principle that some people were racially unfit for American citizenship. The men and women it targeted had built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, reclaimed the swamplands of the Sacramento Delta for agriculture, worked the mines and farms and fisheries of the American West, and established communities from San Francisco to San Diego that were woven into the commercial and social fabric of California and the Western territories. None of that mattered. The law remained in effect for 61 years. Under its provisions and the successively more restrictive acts that followed, the Geary Act of 1892, which required all Chinese residents to carry identification papers at all times or face deportation, the Scott Act of 1888, which banned Chinese workers who had left the United States from returning even if they held valid residency papers, the Chinese population of the United States fell from over 100,000 in 1890 to 61,639 by 1920. Chinese immigrants could not become citizens, could not own land in many Western states, could not testify in court against white defendants, and could not bring their wives and children from China to join them. Families were separated for decades. Men grew old alone in Chinatown boarding houses. The exclusion law was finally repealed on December the 17th, 1943, not out of justice, but out of geopolitical calculation. China was a wartime ally against Japan, and the law had become an embarrassment in the propaganda war against Japanese claims of American racial hypocrisy. Even then, the repeal set a quota of only 105 Chinese immigrants per year. Not until the Immigration Act of 1965 did Congress open the door to Chinese immigration on terms equal to those applied to Europeans. 83 years after the Golden Spike, the people who built the railroad could finally come home.